Hello, and welcome to the Real Reflected, where I have a philosophical look at recent or current events. Today, I'm actually not going to have a look at a particular event. It's more like a phenomenon that keeps occurring in our society. And what I'm talking about are these acts of violence that have been committed in the public sphere. So, not violence that's born from private conflict, but really violence committed and targeted at individuals in the public sphere. And often these acts have been labelled as terrorist, but not necessarily in every single case. But so that's the kind of violence I'm interested in. Now, what I do not want to do today is to say, I'm going to give you an explanation as to why these things occur today. I think it's important to do that, but it's a very complex phenomenon, so that's not what I want to do today. Rather, I want to sort of take a step back and think about what kind of society do we live in for these things to become possible. That's kind of the perspective I want to develop. And I want to look at it from the perspective of control. We're dealing with acts of violence, so there's always that question of which is the threshold that needs to be crossed for somebody to actually act. So the question here is, where does the control lie? And so from the perspective I want to develop, the question becomes, what are the mechanisms of control that are operating upon these individuals? And then also ultimately, how do these individuals, or how do individuals in general, so the members of society, how do they control themselves in our society? So that's kind of the question I want to ask today. The concept I want to work with is inhibition. More particularly, it's the difference between inhibition and disinhibition. Now, when we think of inhibition, we often think of it as not acting, but that's not exactly how I'd like to define it here. With regard to an individual, I think you can think of it as not allowing yourself to act or not allowing certain actions to take place. So it's that idea of the threshold. There's a mechanism of inhibition that prevents certain actions from taking place. That's the kind of definition I want to use. And in that way, it functions as a mechanism of control, right, of controlling the members of society. Now, there's many ways in which, in history, this has been done. I think just one example, in pre-modern society, religious practice has been a major mechanism of control. And then when you look at modern society, there's another mechanism of control which has been developed actually in the work of a French philosopher, 20th century French philosopher called Michel Foucault, and that's called discipline. So discipline here used as a way to analyse how society, how certain power structures, as Foucault would call it, control individuals, control the members of that society. Now, when you hit discipline, it's a word we know from day-to-day language, right? I think there's two aspects to it. It's to discipline, like the person to be disciplined, or the people that need to be disciplined need to be coerced into it, right? So there's that element of sometimes violence, but at least there's always that threat of punishment, or there is punishment incorporated into the mechanism of disciplining. And then from the other point of view, the individual itself, that needs to be disciplined, there's the element of acquiring discipline, right? At some point it's internalized. The example today would be perhaps sports, where the athlete needs to have the discipline to stick to a training plan or a nutrition plan, or things like that, right? It's that internalized discipline. So I think the most prominent example in modern society of discipline at work would be the school system. But other examples, and again, this is developed by Michel Foucault, would be the factory, maybe to some extent the hospital, or even the family, although I think the last two are a bit more complicated, more complex examples. But the school and the factory, right? These are spaces in which discipline operates. And how does that operate? Well, basically the idea is you want to regulate exactly how the bodies of the individuals concerned, how they move through space. So we're trying to define and limit in discipline a trajectory, a very precise trajectory to which the individuals need to adhere. That's the idea of discipline. So the idea of regulation, idea of controlling exact motions of bodies in a particular space. So we see these two elements are very important. The idea of a particular line, you can call it a line of conduct if you will, but so a very particular defined line and a very strictly defined space, right? So we have a geometry which is very fixed and stable. That is the space in which discipline functions. And it's necessary for discipline to function. So that's, I guess, something that's very prominent in modern society, a closed space in which discipline functions. So now if we look at the society today, I think now we are evolving towards, or perhaps we are already in, what you can then call a post-disciplinary society, a society in which this mechanism seems to no longer operate, at least not to the same extent as before. So how then to define this kind of society? Well, I think the first thing to do is to just use negative terms, right? If before it was discipline and a very strict territorial framework, then today we should talk about deterritorialization. So this territory is no longer stable. There is no longer that particular fixed geometry. And deterritorialization is not coincidentally a concept developed by another 20th century French philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, who was also quite closely affiliated with Foucault. So I'm not going to explain this in greater detail, but the idea is quite clear, right? There is no longer that fixed geometry that we have in discipline. And so the bodies of the individuals are no longer moving along a very strictly defined line, a very strictly defined trajectory in that particular space. So what does that create? Well, if before discipline worked as a mechanism of inhibition, and again, this doesn't mean a simple negative mechanism of restraint, right, as I defined it before. So if that's no longer the case, then what do we have? Well, we have forms of disinhibition, right? Things are no longer stable and defined. So we're entering a world where we are using negative terms now to describe it. So that's why I'm saying deterritorialization, disinhibition. I think it's important to use negative concepts here for two reasons. First of all, when you are experiencing, as we are today, a sort of new form of society, it's not very clear what exactly it is, right? That's the way it goes in history, right? You don't really define something very clearly or identify something very clearly until afterwards. So as you're experiencing it, it's no longer very clear what it actually is. You can just oppose it to what it is not anymore. So negative concepts work in that sense. But I think there's a second reason, that's I think the important thing here, is that negativity, so that lack of stability, that lack of fixed geometry, fixed space, clear identity, that is incorporating itself into the individuals that make up our society. So when you think of the way individuals are controlled and constructed today, that fluidity, as some would call it, or that lack of stable space, well, it's incorporated into these individuals. So what we're seeing now is a very different mode of existence. The way people exist today is very different and perhaps more complicated for that reason. We're no longer able to easily define who we are and what space we're in. And so that's, I think, a key element here in the phenomenon that I'm trying to analyze. Again, it's not to just simply explain the type of violence that we are witnessing today, but just to say, in our society where you have this kind of form of disinhibition, this kind of violence becomes possible. So I think that this kind of perspective allows us to make sense of this particular type of violence in a bit of a different way. Often when people try to analyze this kind of phenomenon, so violence, quite often very brutal violence, they talk about it in moral terms, right? They say the people that commit these acts have lost their moral compass. We're losing our foundation of our civilization. We need to re-civilize people. So it's very moralistic. And I think the problem with that is, first of all, you're creating a very dualistic worldview, right? There's the good and the bad, or even evil, as some people would call it. And then you put some people in one category and other people in the other category, and it allows you to have a very easy framework, right? We can judge people. Reality doesn't really work that way. So I think it's a bit really too simplistic. Whereas in the line of thought I've been trying to explore here, where you're thinking in terms of what are the power mechanisms at work, how are people controlled, how are people constructed, right? And what's the mode of existence of people today? I think it reveals much more of the complexity and the different layers of meaning that make up our existence here today, right? So I think in the end, we can learn more from that, even though we are, as we always do in philosophy, making things more complex by thinking about it. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. So thank you for watching, and we'll talk about something else next time.